It started like any other segment. The studio lights were sharp. The set was clinical and quiet, like a courtroom waiting for someone to speak out of turn. Stephen Miller adjusted his jacket. Karoline Leavitt crossed her legs. The host smiled, but the silence underneath it was tight. The topic on paper was immigration reform. A standard debate. One that would end in sound bites, not headlines. But before the cameras rolled, something shifted. Stephen had requested the talking points be sent over in advance. He wanted control. He always did. Karoline, however, had sent nothing. She never did. As the countdown began in the earpiece, the room settled into a familiar rhythm. Except for one thing. Karoline wasn't looking at the host. She was watching Stephen. Like she knew something he didn't think she knew. The host opened with the usual lead-in. Tonight, a conversation on the future of immigration policy with two of the most outspoken figures in Washington. He smiled toward the camera. To my left, Stephen Miller, former senior advisor to the White House. To my right, Karoline Leavitt, former White House press assistant and rising conservative voice. Let's get into it. Stephen began first. His words were clipped, prepared, and airtight. He spoke about national security. He spoke about data. He quoted himself from 3 op-eds. But Karoline did not interrupt. She didn't even blink. When the host turned to her, she smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile you give when you're waiting your turn. It was the kind you give when you've seen the floor before it gives way. Stephen raises important points, she began. But I think we need to talk about something that's been left out of every one of his talking points. Her voice was calm, measured, deliberate. Stephen tilted his head slightly, then narrowed his eyes. Karoline continued. Because when we talk about immigration, we're also talking about values. And values don't start at the border. They start at home. Stephen shifted, just enough to be noticed. Do you mean policy values? The host asked, trying to steady the table. No, Karoline said. I mean personal ones. And then she turned to Stephen fully. Stephen, I'm going to ask you a question. And I think your answer matters more than anything you've prepared tonight. Her voice didn't waver. The host tried to step in. We're here to debate legislation. Karoline raised one hand. Still calm. Still composed. It's a simple question, she said. And I think the audience deserves to hear it. Stephen's jaw had set. The look in his eyes changed. He knew what was coming. He just didn't know how much. The silence was now too heavy to ignore. And Karoline asked the question. Do you think it's appropriate, she said slowly, to stand on national television and lecture families about values, while your own marriage is under investigation for immigration fraud? The air left the room. The host went pale. Stephen froze. And no one spoke. The cameras caught everything. The twitch in Stephen's temple. The silent calculation behind his eyes. And the first crack in a reputation built on absolute control. The host tried to recover. Let's take a break and reset. But Karoline didn't move. And neither did Stephen. Because in that moment, the debate was no longer about policy. It was about the gap between what a man says on camera and how he lives off it. And that gap had just been dragged into the light. The cameras did not cut. Despite the producer's silent signals from behind the glass, the feed stayed live. And Stephen Miller stayed motionless. He did not speak. He did not look at Karoline. He stared forward, unblinking, into the space just above the camera lens. As if there might be a version of this moment somewhere else. One where the question had not been asked. But it had. And the audience knew it. The silence in the studio wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Everyone could feel it. Something real had happened. The host finally found his voice. He turned toward the control booth and said, "Let's take 2. But again, Karoline didn't move. She kept her eyes on Stephen. She spoke directly, with no heat, no performance. You once said, she began, if we lose our standards at the border, we lose our identity. That's your quote. She paused. But it seems to me, if a man preaches loyalty to rules in public while asking for exceptions in private, that's not identity. That's something else. Stephen turned to her. And when he did, it wasn't the look of a man ready to respond. It was the look of a man deciding how much to reveal and how much to destroy. He leaned forward, folding his hands. You want to make this personal? He said softly. Fine. Then louder to the host. Let her finish. Let's not pretend we're not already off script. The host said nothing. Karoline stayed where she was. Stephen adjusted his tie, tighter than necessary. He spoke slowly. My wife is the daughter of legal immigrants. She has never violated the law, and neither have I. What you're referring to is a bureaucratic error in an I-130 adjustment, which was corrected before adjudication. But you don't care about that. You're not here for truth. You're here for headlines. Karoline let the words hang. Then she said, if it was an error, why did you threaten a USCIS whistleblower behind closed doors? The host physically recoiled. Stephen's lips parted, but no words came out. The table between them might as well have been a courtroom bench. Karoline did not smile. She didn't need to, because this wasn't theater for her. It was justice, and it wasn't personal, not in the way Stephen thought. It was about the hypocrisy of preaching legal order while pressuring systems to bend for you when no one is watching. The story hadn't aired yet, but Karoline knew it was coming. A DHS report, an internal memo, names blacked out, but not hard to trace. Stephen had assumed it would be buried under politics. He hadn't assumed someone like Karoline would be holding a microphone when it surfaced. He reached for control again. You've made your point, he said. But let's remind the audience who's sitting here. He turned toward the camera. I served the United States for 4 years under a president elected by millions. I wrote immigration policy. I stood for law and order. And I don't take lectures from press assistants who climbed ladders built by other people's work. The studio waited for her response. And when Karoline spoke, her voice was low, even, measured. You stood for law and order until law and order applied to you. She didn't blink. That's not public service. That's selective enforcement. And this country sees it now. Stephen's hands curled slightly on the desk. The host finally leaned in, voice shaking. We're going to break. Now. The screen faded. But inside the studio, nothing faded. The tension remained. The story had broken through. And Stephen knew something now that he hadn't fully understood before that moment. This wasn't about immigration. It was about exposure. And exposure, once it begins, doesn't stop just because the cameras do. The commercial break ended. But the story didn't. When the cameras turned back on, the host's smile had vanished. His voice was flatter, tighter, and the teleprompter no longer mattered. He welcomed the audience back with a single line that barely concealed the tension. We're continuing a candid conversation. Stephen Miller shifted in his seat, no longer trying to perform. The calculation had drained from his eyes. What remained was something colder, something heavier. Karoline Leavitt had not moved an inch. And she wasn't done. Stephen looked toward the host. If this is now a deposition, he said, I'd at least like the chance to respond fully. Karoline nodded once. She folded her hands. You have the floor. Stephen turned toward the camera, not to the host, not to Karoline. It was the only place that still felt like his. My wife has been harassed. Her family has received threats. All because people like Karoline want to weaponize process errors into political ammunition. His voice was steady, but it had lost its precision. Each sentence landed like a defense built too late. This isn't about justice, Stephen continued. It's about revenge. A former staffer trying to make a name by dragging a family through the mud. Karoline didn't interrupt. When he stopped speaking, she waited 3 seconds. Then she reached into her folder and placed a document on the desk. She didn't hold it up for the camera. She didn't read it aloud. But she slid it toward Stephen. And when he looked down, his entire face changed. It was not a leak. It was not a headline. It was an official memo from the Department of Homeland Security. Internal routing. Authenticated seal. Marked, internal inquiry closed, pending OIG review. Stephen didn't touch the paper. Karoline looked directly at him. No redactions, she said. Nothing cherry-picked. This is the full memo. The host leaned forward. Karoline, how did you? But she wasn't looking at him. She was watching Stephen read the signature line at the bottom of the memo. Because it was someone he knew. Someone who had sat beside him in briefings. Someone who had chosen to go on record, quietly, after resigning. Stephen cleared his throat. He folded his hands again. But the damage was already unfolding in real time. Because 20 seconds after the paper hit the desk, producers backstage began receiving calls. One from the network's legal team. Another from the executive producer. And a third, from someone at DHS, quietly requesting a copy of the segment. Stephen turned to the host. This memo, he said, has not been verified. And if it was obtained without authorization, then this show may be complicit in the illegal dissemination of government property. The host froze. But Karoline didn't. That's not true, she said calmly. It was obtained through FOIA. 6 weeks ago. Your name was on the initial request log. Stephen didn't respond. Because now, it wasn't about winning. It was about containment. And the container had already cracked. The audience, quiet until now, began to murmur. Not loud, but not neutral either. Because what they were seeing wasn't spin. It wasn't just two people arguing. It was something rarer. Someone refusing to look away from power when it tried to hide behind protocol. The host shuffled his papers. He tried to break the tension. Maybe we take a step back here, But no one heard what came next. Because in that moment, Stephen Miller stood up. Without a word. Without a gesture. He stood, removed his mic, and handed it to a nearby assistant. The audience watched in silence. He turned to Karoline. His voice was low, flat. You just made yourself a target, he said. Karoline nodded once. So be it. And then he walked off set. Stephen Miller walked off the set. But the story didn't walk with him. It stayed in the room. It stayed on camera. And more importantly, it stayed online. Within 40 minutes, the clip had surfaced. Not the whole interview, just the moment. The slide of the memo across the desk. The look on Stephen's face. The silence that followed. It was enough. By the time Karoline left the building, the hashtags were already forming. Hashtag the memo. Hashtag Leavitt versus Miller. And one more, strange and unexpected. Hashtag she did not blink. The video was shared not for drama, but for what it revealed. A moment when the machinery cracked. When someone known for scripting narratives had run out of lines to say. Karoline didn't post about it. She didn't make a statement. She didn't need to. Because silence, when earned, speaks louder than spin. That night, the phone call started. The first came from a former White House staffer who asked not to be quoted. Then from a producer at another network asking if Karoline would come on air to clarify what happened. And then, quietly, from someone at the Office of Inspector General. We're aware of the memo, they said. We'd like to confirm your version matches what's in the record. Karoline didn't ask how they found her. She already knew. The segment had made its way into rooms it wasn't supposed to reach. Not because of her, but because of the paper she placed on the desk. The next morning, she woke to find an email in her inbox. No sender name, just a subject line. I was in the room. He lied. Attached was a signed affidavit. Dated. Typed. Legible. Another former DHS official. Someone who had refused to sign the internal review 2 years ago. Someone who had kept a copy of the original draft. And someone who had seen the memo Karoline revealed and recognized a detail that had been quietly removed. A timestamp. A conversation between Stephen Miller and the acting director of USCIS. Late evening. Off calendar. In which Stephen had requested an expedited procedural clearance for a personal adjustment of status case. The phrasing wasn't criminal, but it was deliberate, and everyone in the system knew what it meant. That document, combined with the memo from the segment, painted a picture that no amount of rhetoric could repaint. Karoline called a lawyer, not for defense, but for integrity. If I'm going to keep talking, she said, I need to be clean. No leaks. No innuendo. Just facts. The lawyer agreed, and then asked, do you understand what happens next? Karoline did. Because when you speak against someone like Stephen Miller, the backlash doesn't come all at once. It comes in waves. The first is discredit. Old interviews. Clips taken out of context. Attempts to make the story about her instead of the documents. The second is deflection. Articles written by proxies. Insinuations of ambition. Allegations that she's being used by forces bigger than herself. But the third wave is the one that matters. The third is silence from people who once stood beside him. Silence from lawmakers. Silence from former colleagues. Not because they agree with Karoline, but because they know the memo is real. And silence, in Washington, is often the first sign of collapse. Karoline stood by her decision. Not because she wanted to bring someone down, but because when power teaches the country to follow rules, while secretly bending them, trust isn't the only thing that breaks. Truth does too. And truth, once broken, has to be spoken out loud before it heals. The fifth day is when things start to move behind the curtain. By then, the moment had gone from clip to conversation. It wasn't just a viral segment anymore. It was a symbol of what happens when someone trusted with power forgets that people are still watching. Stephen Miller had not returned any calls. His official spokesperson issued a vague statement calling the memo selectively edited, even though it hadn't been. That language wasn't for accuracy. It was for delay. Karoline understood the tactic. When the facts are undeniable, you question the timing. You accuse your accuser. You talk louder, not clearer. But something unexpected happened next. A second network reached out, not to invite Karoline on air, but to apologize. Their legal team had reviewed the documents. They had seen the timestamp. They had traced the procedural code used to fast-track the adjustment of status. And now they knew. Someone inside the immigration system had moved a case under pressure. And that pressure came from Stephen. They didn't say this on air, but their silence said it for them. They stopped defending him. Meanwhile, the Office of Inspector General issued a quiet notice. Not public, not leaked, just a single-page request sent to 3 agencies. Preserve all correspondence, notes, and scheduling related to family-based immigration requests from November of that year. Karoline received a copy, not because she asked, but because someone inside the system had quietly placed her on the CC list. No commentary, no signature, just 4 words in the body of the email. Keep telling the truth. The story no longer belonged to Karoline, and it no longer belonged to Stephen. Now it belonged to the people trying to clean up the damage. Former colleagues of Stephen's, men and women who once stood beside him, began to talk off the record. No one called it corruption. No one said crime. But words like favoritism, double standard, and clear conflict of interest began appearing in coverage. Not from pundits, but from civil servants. And then, the moment happened. It wasn't on television. It wasn't on stage. It happened in a subcommittee hearing on immigration oversight. A Republican congressman held up the memo Karoline had revealed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse Stephen Miller by name. But he asked a question the whole room heard. Can anyone here explain how a discretionary protocol used to deny thousands of ordinary cases was suddenly accelerated for someone with direct ties to Executive Policy Council? The room fell still. Because it wasn't a trap. It was a test. A test of whether anyone would answer. No one did. And that silence echoed louder than any speech. Karoline sat at home that night, watching the footage. She didn't smile. She didn't post. Because this wasn't vindication. It was responsibility. She had placed a truth on the table. Now the people in charge had to decide what to do with it. The final consequence was not public. It never is. Stephen Miller did not go to prison. He did not issue a formal apology. There was no resignation letter, no press conference, no moment of collapse for the cameras to catch. Because what happened was quieter than that. And heavier. Over the next several months, Stephen's name stopped appearing in policy briefings. He was quietly removed from advisory boards. The invitations slowed. The segments stopped. A dozen former allies unfollowed him in a single weekend. One of them, a former cabinet member, gave an off-the-record quote to a journalist. He stopped being useful the moment he became a liability. Karoline Leavitt never celebrated. She continued her work. She met with staffers. She reviewed immigration proposals. She responded to emails from whistleblowers now emboldened to speak. Some offered copies of documents. Others offered something more important. Memory. The stories of how decisions were made. What was said in rooms not meant for sunlight. Who looked away, and who helped. One message stood out. It came from a former caseworker who had processed asylum applications during the same year the memo was signed. She had once been reprimanded for asking why a particular family's petition was delayed 6 times despite meeting every requirement. In her message, she wrote, "I remember the day that exception was approved. They told us it came from above. Now I know who above was." Karoline read it twice. Because the story had always been bigger than a confrontation. Bigger than a memo. Bigger than Stephen Miller. It was about a system where power bends rules. And where silence becomes policy. In the months that followed, 3 internal procedures were reviewed. One was revised entirely. And a new line was added to the USCIS training manual. No discretionary adjustment may proceed without written justification and review. That sentence didn't carry Karoline's name. But it carried her shadow. Because change doesn't always wear a headline. Sometimes it lives in policy. In caution. In the quiet discomfort of people now forced to think before they act. Karoline didn't try to build a brand on what happened. She didn't write a book. She didn't go on tour. But something about her had changed. Not because she had won. But because she had withstood. Stephen Miller had tried to silence a voice that wasn't his to manage. He had walked onto that set with confidence, control, and a strategy. He walked off with none of those things. And Karoline, without raising her voice, without attacking his character, had done what so many never dare to do in politics. She told the truth. She did not blink. And she let the world decide what to do next. The world listened. And the silence that followed Stephen Miller was an outrage. It was rejection. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that simply stops answering his calls.